Welcome to the New Haven Museum's presentation, Exploring the Way Sisters, Ingenuity in the Work of Two Early Connecticut Women Artists, as part of our celebration of Women's History Month. And again, we're thanking the UI for their lead support in helping us bring this to you this evening. Tanya Port is curator of the Lyman Allyn Art Museum in New London, where she recently organized the Way Sisters, miniaturists of the early Republic, and contributed to the exhibition catalog. Holding a PhD in American history from the University of Delaware, she was previously a Marcia Brady Tucker Fellow in American Paintings and Sculpture at the Yale University Art Gallery. 3 years ago this month, Tanya was a guest curator at the New Haven Museum, having organized the exhibition Capturing Life and Beauty, Women Artists of the New Haven Paint and Clay Club. It is my pleasure to welcome Tanya back, only this time virtually. Tanya, are you ready?
I am. Thank you so much, Kimberly, and many
You're
thanks
welcome.
to the New Haven Museum for this opportunity to be part of your community again, and to talk again about women artists. I'm delighted to be here, and thrilled to talk a little bit about two amazing women artists who were among the earliest professional artists working in America. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. So I have some images today from this exhibition that was recently held at the Lyman Allyn Art Museum. That was the sort of first ever exhibition to focus on the work of these two women artists. From New London, sister artists, Mary Way, who lived from 1769 to 1833, and Elizabeth, known as Betsy Way Champlain, who lived from 1771 to 1825. They were working between the late 1780s and 1825, producing unique dressed paper portrait miniatures with fabric clothing that were unlike anything else being produced in America at this time. The sisters' work evolved over time, shifting away from dressed textile miniatures by about 1805. They painted watercolor portrait miniatures on paper and ivory with growing proficiency over the course of their careers, portraying friends, relatives, and acquaintances, as well as Southeastern Connecticut's mercantile elite. Betsy Way Champlain remained in New London, Connecticut throughout her life. And these are just some installation views of works from the exhibition. While the unmarried Mary Way moved to New York City in 1811, expanding her artistic sphere and advancing her skills. She advertised as a painter, a miniaturist, and a drawing instructor, and supported herself as an artist and teaching young women until her eyesight failed and she went blind in 1820. This exhibition was the first to trace what was known of the sisters' artistic production, celebrating their stylistic and material innovations. It also examined the identities of their sitters, exploring Connecticut's history in the decades following the American Revolutionary War. Now, one element that I think is interesting to point out is that the sisters' identity was forgotten for a long time and only rediscovered in 1992 when Mary Way was identified as the creator of dressed portrait miniatures when this particular example, this portrait of Charles Holt, was identified and published. And you can see on the right, on the verso of this, it is signed Mary Way, 1800, New London. And so there was an article published in 1992 by William Lamson Warren that identified this group of dressed miniatures as being by the hand of Mary Way. So what's interesting is the work had been known. So for example, this is one of the sisters' beautiful dressed miniatures that was in the collection of the Yale Art Gallery since 1940. But for a long time, it was a valued, unique, interesting piece, but the artist was unidentified, was unknown. So this process of really trying to sort of learn as much as possible about Mary Way, and then it was only a little bit later that the identity of her sister, Betsy Way, was kind of brought to light. And for this reason, people knew for a long time the name Mary Way, or, in the last 30 years or so. But Betsy Way's work, Betsy Way Champlain's work, has been slower to kind of be recognized and be acknowledged, because she was recognized a little bit belatedly after her sister. And this is partly because Betsy did not leave New London. And so there are fewer documented traces of her work and her life. She didn't advertise as a teacher. She didn't sign her work. She didn't sort of advertise, or promote her identity as an artist. And it's partly because she lived within this tight-knit community where her work, her talent spread through word of mouth. And so there wasn't the need to advertise. Everyone knew that she was, and her sister referred to her as Painter General in New London. But it's fascinating to think about this and to think about how, for both the sisters, gender was such an important component in sort of thinking about understanding their work. And this is something that we'll talk about, in the next half hour or so, as we look at some pieces together. So it's interesting, as you look at this piece, you'll notice how amazingly sort of three-dimensional it is. It is painted in watercolor on paper, this sort of silhouette of a gentleman. And then the paper is cut, around the profile of his head and face. And it is affixed, glued down onto a fabric backing. And then there are multiple layers, you can see, of different types, different colors, different textures of fabric that are sewn and glued down, to dress this figure. And then in addition to that, there are some little touches that are added with paint, details. So the edging of his vest, the little lines for his buttonholes, his little pocket, those are painted details. And in this is an early work, probably from the early 1790s. There is a lot of detail that you can see here, many different layers of fabric. And some of this work becomes simplified over time. In some of their later work, there might only be a single piece of fabric with details just painted on. But it's fascinating, and we'll see, you know, their work is very distinctive. There are just some images. Here are a few other examples of the dressed miniature portraits of gentlemen. So for Mary and Betsy, gender was an inescapable component of their artistic identity. They likely did not receive formal artistic training, but they adapted skills from their schooling in the domestic arts to create unique collaged miniature portraits. This shift from schoolgirl projects to producing a new type of professional miniature portrait was a significant one. It demanded considerable artistic agency, ingenuity, and social finesse. The sisters' development as artists was likely supported by the encouragement of friends and family members, but it required strength and independence. In a letter to a friend, Mary described what propelled her forward: ardent hopes, desires, and that enthusiasm that inspires and animates the soul to contend with obstacles and triumph over difficulties. And so we have quite a few letters that exist that were written between the sisters and other family members that document the later period of their lives. So after Mary moves from New London to New York City in 1811, that's when there is a lot of correspondence that has been preserved, which is really useful. But what's challenging is that the earliest period when they were working, when they were producing, you know, these extraordinary dressed miniatures, there aren't letters or documentation that talk about their training or how their style evolved. So, you know, a lot of this is, you know, we just have the material evidence of the objects themselves to learn from. And it's exciting, you know, that there are quite a few examples of their work that have come out of the woodwork since 1992, or, you know, since they've been gradually, their work and identity has come to light. In our exhibition, we had about 85 miniatures attributed to the Way sisters. And I think, you know, one could easily say there are at least 100 known examples of miniatures by the two sisters, and probably, you know, other examples out there that we just don't know about yet, which is a pretty extraordinary example of preservation. These are very tiny objects for the most part, 2 inches, 2.5 inches. And so there are lots of places where miniatures can kind of be lost and then potentially found again. There were a couple of pieces in the show, you know, that show some variety in terms of size and materials and format. These 2 full-length figures had just fairly recently come out at auction and were, you know, sort of, you know, came out to the public's awareness in, I think, 2019 and 2021, or 2020 and 2021, recently in any event, these 2, and they're, you know, the figures themselves are maybe 9 inches tall. And these are, in both instances, the figures are watercolor on paper. And one of them has a fabric backing, and the other has paper. But, you know, what is amazing about the sisters' work is the ability to fool the eye, that their skill in painting tiny, tiny details and texture and patterns is so exquisite that you really, we had magnifying glasses in the exhibition so that people could really look closely to try to guess, in some cases, whether they're looking at actual fabric or paper that's painted to look like fabric, or in some cases, as you saw with the gentleman, there were painted details that would cover over the fabric. So it makes it, really this kind of multimedia collage. But they're extraordinary pieces. These two are later examples of profile portraits by Betsy Way Champlain that show she has a fairly distinctive style where there is this kind of shadowy sort of profile that she uses to help delineate the contours of her sitters' faces. And so this style is pretty closely identified with Betsy. And the later work of Betsy's is also fairly easy to identify because if they're pieces that are Connecticut sitters, Betsy's the only one working in New London after Mary leaves in 1811. So these pieces are dated, I think, from the 18 teens or perhaps the early 1820s. And you can see how she is painting these very stylish young women and uses this gold leaf to delineate their jewelry, with these lovely hoop earrings. They also did reverse glass painting. So the gold detailing in the frame, that's painted sort of in reverse on the glass as a framing device for the young woman that we see at right. But these little lovely corkscrew curls, she's very attentive to kind of fashion and, the texture of the sheer fabric that's kind of covering that orange underlayer in this young woman's dress is pretty extraordinary. And we can see here, this more mature style. This is a portrait of the Lyman Allyn's namesake, Captain Lyman Allyn, probably painted to commemorate his marriage to Emma Turner in 1825, maybe a little bit before that, as an engagement piece. And this is painted in watercolor on a very, very thin disc of ivory. And this is the typical material and format that artists producing miniatures used in this era, going back a ways. For the Way sisters, they came a little bit later to the sort of formal technical style and approach that standard sort of well-trained miniaturists used because they were self-taught and coming out of the textile tradition. Their work, they start out, really with their own unique style. And then I think as they're exposed to, they see the examples of other miniatures out there, then their work more closely resembles that of other miniaturists. So for a long time, this portrait of Lyman Allyn has been in the museum's collection since its beginning, just about, but it was again listed as an unknown artist for a very long time. And because it wasn't a dressed miniature, and it was the work of Betsy, it was slower to be recognized because of that. So this here is the only known self-portrait by, or portrait at all by either of the sisters. And this is Betsy's portrait of herself that was painted with the intention that she was going to send it to her sister in New York City to document her appearance. And she works on this in 1818. And this is, 7 years that the sisters had been apart and they hadn't seen one another in this time. And there's a really beautiful letter where they talk about the plan to Mary writes that she has an unconquerable urge to see her sister, to see an image of her, and asks her to sort of paint herself in one of her fancy outfits, one of her costumes, and says that she will paint a portrait of herself, and they'll exchange them through the mail. And sadly, I think that did not happen. Mary Way was beginning to go blind in one eye by the time this plan for a swap had been initiated. And, there isn't any evidence that she was able to paint an image of herself. But this is an amazing thing that testifies to the history and these close familial bonds between the two sisters. So, as I had said initially, the sisters' work and their skills in textile arts probably came about through the traditional schooling that many young women would receive in Connecticut in this era of sort of the late colonial period, the early Republic. And they, young women might be schooled by a family member or in a female academy. There were a number of kind of quite small or larger schools that were run by women, and several of which, are known in Connecticut that are well identified. And there's been the suggestion that perhaps the Way sisters had a connection with a school run by Lucy Perkins Carew in Norwich, Connecticut. And the evidence is a little bit, there's not much evidence. But there are some pieces that still exist that document work done by young women in this school. And there was at least friendship and, the families knew one another, certainly. So we had a couple of pieces of needlework that were on view in the exhibition to kind of show this typical training and the type of work that young women would produce in this era, just to give a sense of sort of how beautiful and skilled this work could be. So this is a fairly, simple sampler that's produced by Lucretia Carew, age 12, working under her mother's tutelage in Norwich. And then we had also this drop dead gorgeous, extremely beautiful mourning embroidery that the same young woman, Lucretia Carew, produced 10 years later, that commemorates, tragically, the death of her sister. So at the center of this piece, there is a self-portrait of Lucretia, a portrait of her mother, her father, and her brother mourning at the tomb of her sister, Lucy Carew Tillinghast. And it's, probably, of course, this tomb is, maybe not what her actual tomb looked like. There were formulaic conventions for how young women would portray mourning scenes in this era. And they were quite a popular subject, particularly around this time with the death of George Washington. There was this spread in popularity of mourning scenes dedicated to Washington's memory, and then other more personal scenes as well. And here are a couple of detailed views that you can see of just how amazingly, talented this young woman was, and the work, the sort of training of Lucy Perkins Carew and this family. So these figures here left, and it's difficult to see in reproduction, but their faces are painted in watercolor on silk, and they have cut pieces of cloth clothing, that are attached to the rest of the sewn embroidered composition. And this was somewhat unusual. This sort of applique style of clothing was above and beyond what a lot of young women would produce. But it is suggestive, and I think it offers, a fascinating example of, work that the Way sisters might have seen or been involved with that would then inform these portrait miniatures that they produced around the same period generally. And we know that they were familiar with the Carew family because they produced this dressed miniature portrait of Lucretia Carew's cousin, Polly Molly Carew. And this is probably the earliest piece that is known by the Way sisters, from probably 1787, 1788. And it's an extraordinary treasure. So as we've been talking a little bit about how they would have acquired this training. I think it's important to point out the challenges that these women faced. Gendered expectations and family roles restricted their mobility and limited their careers as miniaturists. They were not able to travel in search of patrons, which is the format that male itinerant portraitists followed. So there were men who were painting portraits who often, traveled, they might spend a week in a city or town and, find patrons, paint portraits, and then move on as soon as their supply dried up. But young women were not easily able to do this. There were a few. There's an example, this Susanna Payne did paint portraits, larger easel-sized portraits, a little bit later than the Way sisters. And she wrote a very interesting memoir that talks about her experiences as an itinerant artist. She says, that after she arrived in a new town, visitors would enter her temporary studio, quote, with eager looks to see whether a woman could paint a likeness. And you can see that, sorry, it's not a great reproduction, but she advertised her services as a portrait painter, and was able to travel. And here, I think she's in Portland, Maine. A little bit later than the Way sisters again, Eliza Goodridge painted miniature portraits in Massachusetts. And here is an example of her work. But for the most part, it is men. And one, William Bursteal, is someone who passed through New London, Connecticut, and also painted in Massachusetts and elsewhere, and sort of would make these sweeps through the region. And when he did so, left behind portraits like this one, which portrays Mary Avery Smith. This is a piece from our collection that is watercolor on ivory. So you can kind of get a sense of the prevailing style. Many times these portrait miniatures that are painted in watercolor on ivory would be enclosed in these lockets and covered by glass to protect them, with a sort of a brass frame. And often there might be either another image on the back or a little window where you could put a lock of hair belonging to the person who's portrayed in this miniature. And this is a format, that we don't really know today because it was supplanted by the invention of photography. So in the period before photography, the late 18th century and the early 19th century, these painted miniature portraits really flourished, and they were everywhere. And for $5, for $3, there was a kind of range depending on the materials you chose, the kind of case that you needed to hold it. Some examples on paper, you might have a fairly simple silhouette that might be $1. There's a kind of sliding scale in terms of skill and proficiency. Here's another piece in our collection that depicts a New Haven resident whose identity I still need to research a little more thoroughly, J.S. Foote of New Haven. And Dickinson was painting in Litchfield primarily, and then ended up eventually in New York City, but a very skilled miniaturist. So the Way sisters, essentially what they do is they take this existing portrait miniature tradition and combine it with their skill in needlework and textile arts. And they invent this kind of subgenre that is the dressed miniature portrait. And maybe, I'm not sure, if at the time they realized how unique their work was. But they really are only working in this mode for 10, possibly 15 years or so. And I think at a certain point, realize, that no one else, is really making pieces quite like theirs. And so they shift gears and stop doing their dressed miniatures, which is unfortunate, because today that material is what collectors and the art market are most interested in. It's really what makes their work unique, is these dressed miniatures. Sorry, I keep jumping back and forth here. And just here, this is a larger easel-sized portrait that shows an example of how a woman in the late 18th century would wear her portrait miniature. You can see it's on a ribbon tied around her neck. And in this case, it's kind of facing outward so that we, the viewers of this larger painting, can see her displaying this miniature portrait of her husband. And usually, they're very personal objects. They would be worn on the body, as a necklace or maybe tucked into a pocket, documenting the person who's most special to you, possibly a child, your spouse. And, they really commemorate love, and in some cases death. There are pieces that would be done for mourning purposes, but often exchanged to commemorate marriage or engagement. So they're very special. This is a fantastic little double-sided miniature that was on view in the exhibition in the Connecticut Historical Society's collection. So this was created to commemorate the marriage of Sarah Raymond Smith and Captain Shubal Smith in 1796. And it's interesting to me to think, that this is one object, double-sided. I mean, presumably Sarah would wear this around her neck. But, often what makes these special is that, the husband has an image of the wife, to hold and to keep. And particularly in, a seafaring community like New London, where husbands would go off to sea. It would be a chance, when you're separated, to have this image of your beloved close to your body, close to your heart, so you can remember them while they're gone. And there are other examples that you can see that really show just their really unusual use of materials. This frame, the kind of matte and this really elaborate marble paper, and then this braided sort of metallic cording that's used to differentiate, the oval marking this portrait from the mat and the frame, was a piece created by the Way sisters, and just shows their ingenuity. And I think that they must have drawn on materials that they had at hand, while Betsy is sewing clothing for her children, or while they're making textiles to use within the house, or sharing things between them. They would take scraps, pieces of things that are left over, and incorporate them into their art wherever they could. This was a panel from within the exhibition that showed portraits of children, and these were really lovely, very charming portraits, but they're using different materials. So the bottom two are dressed portraits of little girls, and then the two top left are early watercolor on ivory portraits. And you can see here's a closer view of one of the lower little girls, and she holds a bird on a string, pet, and then, seems to be sort of offering it maybe cherries or flowers. And this iconography is common in portraits of children from this era. So, and this is a closer view of these two portraits of the Hind children. And you can see the way they've treated the ivory is very unusual, not common at all for professionally trained miniaturists. So what they've done is they've painted black gouache, against the profile of these two children, in a way that is very, very similar, of course, to the way they're working with fabric and paper. And so I think they're kind of using the ivory, as though it were fabric. But ivory is, what makes it so beautiful is its translucent quality. And so watercolorists, traditional miniaturists, someone like Anson Dickinson or William Bursteal, always had, fairly light backgrounds that show that translucency to better effect. We had some interesting examples of sitters, that we know quite a bit about their identity and their history in this exhibition. And it was interesting to be able to talk about the events of the Revolutionary era in Connecticut and how some of these sitters were involved. So someone like Christopher Prince fought in the Connecticut Navy, and then later worked as a privateer. And he kept a journal, a diary, and sort of has this later autobiography that he wrote, documenting all of this interaction with these events happening in New London, talks about going off to sea. He describes coming back into the harbor the evening after the British had attacked and burned New London, September 6, 1781, and seeing buildings smoldering, being afraid for the lives of those he held dear. So it's a great resource. I was thrilled to be able to read his autobiography and then, use that information to really help understand, the role that he played in the revolution. This is a slightly larger, this is a little bit more unique piece that's about 5¼ inches high. And this is one where it's mostly painted paper, but then you can see the blue fabric of his jacket is a single piece of silk, and it has painted buttons and a little bit of an indication of, his lapel and the collar on that jacket. He was the lighthouse keeper of the Little Gull Lighthouse. So it's nice to be able to, and you can see he's got this charming little earring. He's quite handsome. We were all fond of him. Other figures, played significant roles in Revolutionary era and the post-Revolutionary era region. Jedediah Huntington is a major figure, a familiar name. And there are other families within New London. Here, Sarah Deshon Wheat, Samuel Wheat. We also have miniature portraits of her parents, painted by the Way sisters. So it's exciting to really think about these connections between families and the way that the Way sisters are working through familial links to depict their sitters. We have a portrait of this older woman here, Sarah Deshon Wheat, when she was a young girl at the age of, I think, about 14, in a larger portrait painted by another artist, William Johnston. And I was reminded by Margaret Ann of a connection between the Saltonstall family of New London, who then various family members end up in New Haven. And so there's a great kinship here. At the Lyman Allyn, we have this Joseph Blackburn portrait of Gurdon Sultan of Stall II. And clearly, this is a larger family commission. So Gurdon, there's a portrait of him. This is a portrait of one of his daughters, Mary Saltonstall, from a little bit later. And then this gorgeous portrait of 4 other children, Saltonstall children of Gurdon II. And I love just how beautiful, this painting, it almost looks like these figures are dancing. The kind of movement that's connecting them as they share fruit, as Martha at right sort of holds a flower for her sister to smell, just how engaged they are with one another. And Joseph Blackburn, of course, is a professionally trained artist, a British artist who trains in England and then brings his skills and his painting in Connecticut and in the Boston area for some time. And you can see sort of the difference of this training. and his skill in, you know, capturing the kind of the details of the sitters, but also the textile, you know, this kind of shine of the satin of their dresses, and his ability to compose the figures in this pleasing manner is lovely. So what's fun to see, and there are quite a few children. I forget exactly how many, perhaps a dozen or so, of Gurdon II. But here, the young woman in blue sitting at right, Martha Saltonstall, stays in New London. I think it's Henrietta in the gold dress here, marries John Still Miller of New Haven. But Martha stays in New London, marries David Manwaring, and becomes the mother of Rebecca, who many years later, many pounds later, you know, is depicted here as a mature woman, married to Elisha Coit in New London, in this pair of miniature portraits painted by the Way sisters. And you can see there's fabric there on her bonnet, her dress, and, you know, just such character, you know, that comes through in this pair. And we had in the exhibition a number of family members representing the Sage, Saltonstall, and the Huntington families, sort of all intermarried. And that's a little too small to read, I apologize. But we had this miniature portrait of Winthrop Saltonstall, who I think now was one of the sons, I think, of Gurdon II, and his daughter-in-law, Hannah Sage Saltonstall, miniature portrait of her by the Way sisters, and then a portrait of her daughter, Mary Hallam Saltonstall, first as a young girl, and then the same young woman is depicted again by Betsy, here as this beautiful young woman, probably commemorating her marriage to Daniel Huntington. And then we also had this extraordinary little portrait of her daughter, Mary Hallam Huntington, from 1814. And you can see just how sweet this is. She has one shoe on, one shoe off, and she's sort of carrying one of her shoes in her hand. And it's a kind of tragic story that Mary, the mother, dies several years later, and Mary, the younger, also dies young. So often, you know, these miniature portraits were painted, I think, with the awareness of how fleeting life could be in this era, you know, where many young children died young, and many young women, you know, died in childbirth, and died of disease. So where they were able to, you know, to celebrate and commemorate major family events, or important junctures with these group commissions, they did so. And it's interesting, just to go back and point out, this group from the Saltonstall family were all, I think, done together in 1798. So it's interesting to think of how the Saltonstalls are, you know, employing Joseph Blackburn here to do a whole, you know, series of portraits. And there are others in other collections as well of other members of the family. And then, you know, they turn again to the Way sisters in New London to commemorate various members of the family. And I suspect that there are other miniature portraits of additional Saltonstalls that we don't know about yet. But here are some of them as they were put together in one of her cases. But, to reflect again, to think about, some of the limitations or the challenges that involve gender in their work and in their careers. I think about Betsy Way Champlain. So she is married, has 4 children of her own. And I think that is largely the reason why she stays in New London her entire life and career. And Mary, who, is not married, she does not have children. She has the flexibility to leave New London and to go to New York City. And I think part of the reason that she does so is because they've saturated the market for portrait miniatures in New London. And she couldn't support herself, in this fairly circumscribed, smallish community. And so originally, I think, it was thought that Mary was the better artist, which is why she goes to New York City. And I don't think that is the case. I think Betsy was an amazingly skilled artist as well, but it's just that their circumstances were different. So this is a large easel painting that we put in the exhibition that is not by the Way sisters. It's painted by a Boston artist, Henry Sargent, but it's painted after a miniature that could have been, it could have been based on Betsy's miniature. So he is based in Gloucester, but comes through New London, Reverend John Murray, and gives a sermon. And at that point, Betsy paints his portrait, and he was so impressed and so loved this miniature portrait that she painted that there are several letters written later that talk about how he is inviting Betsy to come to Gloucester, to come to Boston, to meet his family, to meet his wife, who was Judith Sargent Murray, this amazing, very important proto-feminist writer who had all kinds of sort of fantastic ideas and writings. She wrote several books. She wrote plays, poems. And in the letters, he talks about how he thinks his wife and Betsy would get along very well, and how a trip like this would be a good thing for Mrs. Champlain to come and spend some time at our house, Murray wrote. I have no doubt she would find her account in it, and she may rest assured of her finding from each a sincere and hearty welcome. I am persuaded it would be for her advantage, and we both wish for her to make the experiment. Let me hear from you and tell me you will come. He writes to Betsy, and she doesn't. She doesn't ever leave New London, which is heartbreaking. But I feel, I think that she must have read some of the things that Judith Sargent Murray wrote and published. And the Reverend John Murray was an important figure, a sort of early founding member of the Universalist Church, which the family were believers and adherents to. But it's interesting to get these little snippets and these thoughts of, what might have happened if their circumstances had been different, or if, Betsy had been a little bit more daring or willing to break the mold. And at a certain point, her children were grown, but she doesn't. She stays in New London. This is a kind of lovely group portrait that Mary paints shortly after arriving in New York City. So the portrait on the right of Charles Holt. She also paints his wife, Mary Dobbs Holt, and then later in New York paints their 8 children, their entire family. But beyond this, very little of her work in New York City is known. I think partly because her style shifts and evolves and comes to look more like miniatures that other artists are producing in this era. But there's a lot of really interesting material in the letters where she talks about the experience of being this important artist in a small community and then entering the artistic realm of New York City, and just how she is, went from being a kind of big fish in a little pond, to this much larger pond. And how she struggled with that experience. But you can see this is a little advertisement that is published in a New York newspaper of her advertising her work as a portrait and miniature painter in New York City. And it's heartbreaking, as she begins to go blind, around 1819 and then 1820. Just how heartbreaking that is. And I know, we're perhaps running out of time here. So I maybe won't try to read any more quotes. And maybe, it's time to take a few questions. But I do have some quotes somewhere. And we did produce a catalog for this exhibition, so there's some more information in there. But thank you. It's been such a treat to share some of these details and stories with you today. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. That was just an amazing presentation. I had no idea women way back then could be career women, but that's exactly what they were. They were career women. Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions that came in, and I'm going to put some of them together, because we had initially someone ask about the sisters' work. Did they work with a framer? And then another question came in about, is there any documentation on how these portraits were commissioned, how they were delivered? And also, did the sisters benefit from New London's maritime mercantile trade, especially regarding pigment and ivory that they were working with? I know those were 2 or 3 questions rolled into one, but they're all regarding the commissioning and the finishing of the product.
Yeah, those are great questions. And there is, and I actually happen to have a little quote here. There are some pieces, I think, that ended up in those metal sort of brass lockets. Those they would not have produced. Those would have been, made by sort of watchmaker, jewelers, and were in some cases, sort of imported, and were available in New York for miniaturists. But at one point, Mary writes to Betsy from New York and says, "I set right about making the 2 frames you sent for, worked all day and all night, and have just now completed them. I've lost the larger circle you sent. I think, however, that this one is near the size. If it does not fit, it will do for someone else, and I will make another. If I have more made against the next opportunity, I will have more made against the next opportunity. I think I shall be able to supply you with frames at the old price. That is, if it don't cost all nature to get the glass cut and frames made. I brought a number with me, which I shall make up first." So she made some frames herself. And we know, because we have some in their original frames with, they did, we know they did advertise that they did the reverse painted glass. So some of these were, these kind of square, fairly simple wood frames with glass covering them. And perhaps, in some cases, I know the portrait of the Reverend John Murray, he writes to Betsy and talks about wanting to have a case produced for that. So I think, it depended on the circumstances, whether they had something handy that they had already made, or in some cases, whether a sitter, might have a frame or something produced or a case through another means. But there's also quite a bit of talk about sending materials back and forth. And and it's interesting, you would think that with Ivoryton, nearby, that there would be material and resources coming into New London. But I think Mary does write about sending ivory ovals from New York. And my guess is that because there's just a greater number of artists, they're very, very sort of wafer thin ovals that come in a few different sizes, that are kind of sliced, elephant ivory, that I think that, it was easier to come by from artist shops in New York. And Mary talks about sending, particular colors, ground watercolor, little, what are they called? Little squares of pigment that, in particular colors that I think were harder to come by, maybe more unique colors made from different materials were harder to come by. But I think, and I know that their patrons were many people who were involved in this, mercantile trade. A lot of them were involved in the West Indies trade. And in fact, thinking about materials, those two sort of full-length female figures that I showed images of in the beginning, one of those women is glued onto blue sugar paper, is the backing that's used for her. And this is something that's interesting to think about because of this West Indies trade is really driven by sugar. And of course, work that demands or depends on the slave trade. And so these plantations in the Caribbean are producing sugar for export to England, to America. And the sugar would come wrapped in this blue paper, these kind of sort of blocks of it. And so I think that paper was pretty readily available in New London, because it was a place where, those materials were coming in and then going back out again. That the merchants were trading.
Wow.
But these are great questions. So there's a fair bit that they talk about some things in the letters, but it's only a little bit later on when Mary is in New York. So it's hard to know before that where they're sourcing their materials. But I think some things would be brought in and sold in sort of small stores around New London.
Yeah, we have a couple of people asking if the sisters made good income with their artwork, and someone else was wondering if the sisters taught art as well. And my question was going to be, what training did they have to be such wonderful artists?
I mean, they were self-taught by and large, I think, or depended on this training in the environment of a female academy where, they may have had a little bit of training in drawing. There's no documentation, but some of these schools did, young women did produce watercolors and sketch, but, they wouldn't have received the same kind of training, as a sort of male artist who maybe is an apprentice to another. But in this era, a lot of people didn't. There wasn't much in the way in America of kind of formal artistic training. You pretty much had to go to England, to the Royal Academy, to study with Benjamin West or something. So there are a lot of artists who were, to some degree, self-taught, who started out maybe painting signs, saddle, makers, who then sort of just through practice and trial and error improved their work. I did have a quote, if I can find it. There is this. So in the same letter, actually, where Mary talks about making these two frames, and this is from, I think, around 1816. It isn't dated, but she writes to Betsy, one must pay in New York, she's saying, one must pay here for everything through the nose. Walnut wood is $4 a load. And then she sort of talks a little bit more about the cost of wood. She says, to be obliged to pay out $45 every 3 months for rent, business or no business, is not a very pleasant consideration and keeps one in a quandary, as it were, all the while. No need to think of washing to make you sober. I've just been obliged to scrape together all I could muster for this purpose. Of course, I am rather low in cash at present, as my poor fourpence halfpenny can witness. Except for one pair of shoes, not a single cent have I laid out for wearables since I've been here. But this is a secret. Should the world know my prudence and economy, I should lose my credit entirely. So she's been in New York City for 5 years, maybe 4 years, perhaps, depending on the date of this letter. And she has only managed to pay for one pair of shoes for herself. And the rest, because she's supporting herself as an artist, she's also teaching young women how to sew and paint, and sort of, I think she's teaching a little bit of everything, these young students. She's, just barely sort of scraping together a living. So they do talk about their struggles, and they were not, were not really supporting themselves very well. And it's partly, this was a tricky time period. In 1818, there's a sort of economic downturn, a financial panic. And there are a number of other artists who are also writing about struggling tremendously in this same time period. And which is why, so many male artists have to travel to find patrons. So I think it's a miracle that they did as well as they did. And that they do write in very compelling ways about just how fulfilling it is to be able to make beautiful things. Betsy has this lovely little story about having someone sort of touch one of her miniatures and damage it, and then how she fixes it. And she talks about the miniature as though it were a person, almost like her child, that she's prepared, acted as a surgeon to this piece. And she's sort of, it's a great little story that she's, nursing him back to health and so forth. So they really, took extraordinary pride in their work.
Somebody'd like to know, did any of Betsy's children become artists? Was it a family affair beyond the sisters? And I was wondering, once photography was invented, was that the end of this art?
Kind of, yeah. So Betsy's daughter, Eliza, became a miniature artist, a miniaturist. And she plays a fairly significant role in the letters, particularly because she trains under her mother and under Mary, and she goes back and forth several different times to New York City and then back to New London. And when Mary begins to go blind, she, is the one who's really doing the communicating, and she assists her aunt a great deal, and helps her. And she, I think, does find some success as an artist. She teaches a little bit as well. Less of her work is known. So we didn't have any of it in the exhibition, I'm afraid. But I think later she marries and has children, and then she stops working, shortly after that point. So there isn't much from her she doesn't work throughout her whole life the way these sisters do. And, there is interesting correspondence between some of the other sons. A couple of them, or the other family members, are involved off at sea. One of them works for the customs house in New London. Their step uncle, Uncle Ebb, is the postmaster in New London. So one of the sons works for Uncle Ebb in the post office for a while. So but they write a little bit about their mother. And trying to think if I have any of these quotes. Yes, William, one of Betsy's sons, writes to his sister, Eliza, and he says, this is in around 1824. So this is near the end of Betsy's life. He says, "Mother has learned more within a year about painting than she ever knew in her life before. She's been copying the miniature of a lady here, painted by Nathaniel Rogers of New York. And I think she has done it full as well in point of style, but she has not taken so good a likeness, which ought not, of course, be expected. Had she had the original to set, meaning, the individual in person, she would have made one full as good, if not better. I wish it had been in her power to have been instructed by some person like Rogers. At this time, she would have been independent, but she labors under 1,000 difficulties to prevent her progress in the art, which others have not. The first and last, I might say, in poverty. Could she enjoy the advantages that Rogers and others have? I have the vanity to think she would have excelled some of them." Now, I think he's writing to his sister while she's in New York City, "I think you ought to improve your time in visiting these geniuses and learn the art of finishing a picture as soon as they do. When Mother will be 2 weeks in doing a miniature, they can finish it in 3 days." So, he's kind of lamenting that his mother didn't have better training, but also sort of goading his sister to move faster than his mother does as an artist.
After Mary went blind, did she return to New London?
Yes, she did. There's a nice little episode in New York City where, she'd become friends with this community of other artists, centered around the American Academy of the Arts. And they had a benefit event for her to raise money to help her. And, it was a lovely gesture. And, we're able to give her, I think, $167, something like that. That, in 1820, it's a lot of money. And that allowed her to pay off some of her debts in New York City. She was behind in her rent. she had various debts, that she'd accumulated because she couldn't paint. And so that was really something that she was very, very grateful for. But then after that point, yeah, she had to move back to New London and, have her family kind of take care of her, which I think, was a difficult thing for everyone.
A lot of the feedback has been really very excellent. People are really enjoying tonight, and they're actually asking if they can obtain the catalog for the exhibit and how they can do that.
Yes, it's not very widely, not so easily available, but through the museum, the Lyman Allyn, if you call or email, they can send copies out to anyone who's interested. And the museum website has a sort of general email and phone number that you can find for that, or they can contact me as well to pass that along. But yeah, I keep hoping to get some copies more readily available, and hopefully we'll try to work on them.
And some other people are wondering if the exhibit is going to be shown anywhere else.
No, sadly. These objects are vulnerable to fading. And so we, had an exhibition that was about 3 months. And, to conserve the objects, they've gone back. Many of them were on loan from other institutions. And they're, kind of going back into storage, sadly. But hopefully some of them will be featured, within the different collections where they're owned. And there are a lot in Connecticut. And so, I think if anybody really is very interested, you could perhaps make an appointment to go and see them. And, hopefully some of them will be featured on view again soon. I know the Yale Art Gallery regularly exhibits their miniatures, but, they all have to sort of happen in rotation, so that no one gets faded by too much light. But
we did actually have somebody ask about preservation.
Yeah, and they're extremely delicate. There are not very many people, who even are kind of comfortable opening up, particularly these multimedia pieces that are fabric and watercolor. They're just very, very delicate. We had 2 of our dress miniatures, one of them maybe, where a little piece of one of the ribbons had kind of come loose and was looking unsightly. So we opened it up. We had a paper conservator just kind of take that little piece out and look at it. But she said, it was just so delicate. But what was interesting is in ours, the fabric backing looked like it was this kind of tannish brown color, but when she opened it up, you could see some of the fabric that was on the back side, that was folded around a piece of kind of cardboard. And it was this beautiful emerald green. So it gives a little glimpse into, in some cases, the damage that's already occurred from light exposure. But, our awareness of kind of what these things look like, it's hard to know sometimes, if the colors have shifted over time. And I think they have in many cases. But we're lucky, that we still have as much as we do, that's there to study. So
I know you were a history major. but I'm just curious how you became so invested and interested in miniaturists.
Yeah, well, when I was a curatorial fellow at the Yale Art Gallery, there there was a series of exhibitions, rotations that were happening that I worked on. And they're kind of a niche type of object. In museums, oftentimes they don't, they're in storage. They're a challenge to exhibit and to even really be able to appreciate because they're so small. But the stories that they represent are so compelling and fascinating, and they're little, all art is a kind of a window into a time and a place, and you can tell a whole range of stories depending on what your interests are. So I fell in love with them, and knowing about Mary Way and Betsy Way, being from New London and being in an institution where we have about 10 examples of their work in our collection, and then some interested scholars and collectors in the region. Really it was a good fit, and we had a lot of help, so it was great.
Were you always interested in American art history?
Um, yeah, I mean, I studied art history as an undergraduate. And so, of course, there's beautiful art, and the more you know about anything, I think the more interesting it becomes. Um, you know, Early on, of course, Italian art is beautiful, but there's been a lot more scholarship done on some of that material. And so I had a mentor suggest American art as um, a kind of category that had not been as thoroughly studied as some. And so it seemed like a great idea to think about the stories that help shape our world, and our history. So.
Well, you've done a fabulous job tonight, and much of the feedback I'm reading is so enjoyable, absolutely delightful, wonderful talk. So, on behalf of the New Haven Museum, I'd just like to thank you for helping us celebrate Women's History Month with this very interesting and fascinating, actually, that many of us didn't even know took place. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. There are so many stories like this out there in your collection at the New Haven Museum and elsewhere. So, I know you are all doing great work. It's fun to think about all these ideas together. So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to invite those that are still with us to join us next month on Thursday, April 14th, for Celebrating Connecticut Coastlines and Waterways with Karen B. Davis. So until then, I bid you adieu. Have a wonderful evening.